Hey everyone, how goes it? I'm your instructor, Dr. JJ Shepard, and welcome back to Computer Science 552, Game Development. In the last lectures, we've been discussing concepts related to game production. Taking the idea for a game, we must design it before we can develop it. We're going to focus today on more concepts related to taking the idea for a game and then generating the game concepts. This process is commonly called game design. More specifically, within our production process, we can see that this relates to the game designer and the game design concept phase. As before, game design is the process of drawing from an idea to create the systems, rules, and outcomes that create the core game concept. Creating a game concept is an exercise in communication, or more specifically, writing, and shares many of the same principles and practices. Communication is fundamental to all games, and we consider games to be an interactive, expressive form that is capable of demonstrating nearly limitless concepts. It often surprises early developers to know just how much writing is involved in the design process, but we will soon understand why. People need to understand the game to play it. If people cannot understand how it is played, then they won't play it. Communication is necessary for participation. Developers need to know what the game they are creating and effectively communicate this concept is necessary for it to be successful. Creating a good game concept requires expressing it to others well, which is why writing and game design are very similar. The game concept answers the following questions: who, what, when, why, where, and how. These are the same questions that we seek to answer when we write a story for a book, a TV or internet show, or for a movie. In discussing game design before, we focused on a literary review with the goal of understanding what defines a game and what defines play. We eventually framed these concepts into three schema: rules, play, and culture, where we're only going to focus on rules and play for this course. While this is good for understanding how to define a game, and it certainly helps creating the game concept, it does not practically describe how we create one. This lecture, we focus on the core ideas of creating the game concept in practice. Looking again at Tracy Fullerton's work, Game Design Workshop, a play-centric approach to creating innovative games from 2004. In this work, she provides a quote that we use to define a game. A game is a closed formal system that engages players in structured conflict and resolves its uncertainty in an unequal outcome. This all relates to the game's formal elements. We can think of these practically as describing the parts of the game that we need in order to make it work. In one way or another, all of these elements are a part of creating a game. In practice, these should be included: players, objectives, procedures, rules, resources, conflict, boundary, and outcome. The first, perhaps most obvious formal element is the player. They are a voluntary participant who is engaging with the game's rules and systems. They are an independent active decision maker who demonstrates a illusory attitude. As mentioned previously, this term came from Bernard Suits and helps describe the emotions required for a player to voluntarily accept the rules, which makes achieving the goal less efficient for the purpose of play. We commonly consider that the players as the who, or more specifically, who is playing in defining the game. Next is objective, and this functions as the goal to achieve in the game. This objective provides a purpose to play and compels us to achieve it. This formal element helps us determine the what, or more directly, what must be done in order to achieve the goal. Next, we have procedures that describe actions, methods, or play that is allowed by the rules. This helps describe what the player can do in order to reach the objective. This, however, does not describe how the players must reach their goal. There must be enough space allowed for the players to play within the procedures in order to find their own way. Related to this is the formal element of rules. As we have discovered in the past lectures, the concept of rules can be broad and was a primary formal schema related to games. The formal element defines what a player can and cannot do, which describes the game's procedures or its operational rules. It also defines the game's objectives, which in turn gives the win and loss conditions of the game's outcome. Beyond this, the rules also define the system's internal logic, which are the game's constitutive rules. By doing this, rules describe how the system or the game works. It does not tell the player how to play it, though. The next formal element of game is resources. We can consider these to be the game objects required to play the game. This can be physical items such as dice or pawns, or conceptual items like enemies or referees. When emotions run high, we can sometimes consider the referee to be an enemy. But as we know, they are just a game official or rule keeper. Resources inherently contain value, and that factors into the game's information economy. They are the things that help us determine what the player can use to reach their objectives as defined by the rules. Conflict naturally arises when actions and resources are limited. This is true in other forms of media as well, as it creates a power imbalance that will challenge the player. We seek to limit the procedures and the resources so the objectives are not immediately obtained. If a game had a win button that you would press, then the space of play is so small that there is no room for any emergent play, and so it's boring. Limiting the resources creates territorial conflicts where the resources may change in value over the course of the game. Items may become more or less valuable as the information economy fluctuates. This is where other players attempting to reach the same goal, or adversarial agents called enemies, can affect the resources and further prevent the player from reaching their objective quickly. Conflict helps us define what and who is stopping us. Another formal element that is implied is boundaries. We can understand that when we're playing games, we are not part of ordinary life, as Heising has said before. In fact, this relates to the concept of the magic circle. All play, and by extension games, have this quality, and they exist within their own magic circle of space and time. Boundaries may either be physical, such as the out-of-bounds area of a basketball court, or conceptual, in the sense of the game Uno, where players will not add cards to the draw deck or throw a card that they don't prefer into the garbage. Boundaries are important in play and games, much like real life, and we should always respect those. When we do, we'll have fun and respect one another by demonstrating the implicit rules of behavior. Finally, we reach the outcome of the entire game. A good game has a system that allows for emergent play to occur that requires the outcome to be uncertain. If it were not, this would imply that the system is either fixed or periodic, where the outcome has been predetermined. We want a system that is complex without it being completely chaotic. We create rules that lead to multiple uncertain outcomes so the player can explore the system in a variety of ways. This also implies that outcome is not the same as objective. Players can reach the same objectives, but the outcome answers the question, who wins and who loses? The formal elements specify what is necessary within the game. Yet, beyond formal elements, game also contains dramatic elements. These are the parts that emotionally engage the player. These elements include challenge, play, characters, premise, and story. Challenge is the dramatic element that is inherent in all games. The challenge of the game is related to the formal element of conflict. Players attempting to complete objectives to reach their desired outcome creates tension. Players want to win, and this emotionally engages each player. When challenge is gradually increased, so is the tension and the engagement. This relates to following the flow channel. When the challenge is increased gradually, this keeps the player engaged. However, if the challenge is increased too slowly, then the player may become bored. Or, if the challenge is increased too quickly, the player may become frustrated. Either way, they'll stop playing the game due to the challenge. This element answers the question, how difficult is the game? Related to the flow and challenge is the concept of play, and this is also inherent to all games, as it's considered one of the primary experimental schemas as previously described. As mentioned, play can be considered the freedom of movement within a more rigid system. We are designing the game's system through the formal elements, and we allow enough freedom within the system for emergent play to occur via the player's interactions. We are aware that many games play in similar ways, and this relates back to the idea of game genres. As mentioned, these are games that feature common interactions, objectives, and outcomes, or as I sometimes refer to it, as a play style. We must consider the kind of game that we are creating, and using, mixing, and matching these expected features can help us design the play. This answers the question, how do we interact with the game? While the previous dramatic elements are found in all games, the following are more optional and more frequently found in contemporary games. An optional dramatic element is the game's premise, which provides the context for the formal elements. As the players are decision makers, the premise of a game helps to guide the player's decisions. This provides additional meaning or emotions to the play past what the formal elements of objectives and outcomes can provide. The premise of a game can often attract players as it gives an interesting context to play. We can see this historically by looking at why the game Monopoly was so popular during the Great Depression. The premise of being a wealthy landowner during the time of great hardship and pain was an appealing escape for many people. The premise helps to answer what makes the game interesting. Characters are agents that provide a means or a lens to view a story. Characters connect the player emotionally with the situation, thus imparting empathy for the character's struggles. Video games have long provided many different characters that we can experience their stories through them. In contrast, characters may also serve as the agents preventing the player from reaching their goals. In literature, we refer to these types of characters as protagonists and antagonists. We sympathize and connect with the protagonist's tribulations against the opposing forces of the antagonist. Ultimately, characters help us answer, who in this game should we care about? Finally, story in a game emotionally engages the player by aligning the formal elements with strong dramatic narrative techniques. These are not the same as narrative elements, which we will discuss later. In relation to this, plot device is any technique that moves the story forward. In this way, we can see the story is not the same as the game's premise. Both story and premise provide the context to play, but premise does not need to move forward or have an endpoint. However, a story does progress over time and reaches some kind of conclusion. There is always debate surrounding the question, how much story does a game need? We know that not all games need stories to be engaging, yet some games may not be very engaging without a story. We can, for instance, look at the Japanese role-playing game, or JRPG, Earthbound. This is considered to be one of the best role-playing games on the Super Nintendo console, but its play is effectively selecting items from a menu and watching a spreadsheet update its values. Without its story involving aliens and existentialism, it doesn't seem like a very interesting game. We may also consider how some games may focus too heavily on story, which leaves very little room for play. This is a common criticism for slice of life or walking simulators. The unsatisfying answer is, it depends on the game. However, we can consider that balance is key when creating story for a game. When we want to engage the player with an interesting story, but not take away from the story that we are telling with their experience. In my opinion, books should tell, movies should show, games should play. The formal and dramatic elements are all part of designing a game, but they do not explain how to create a game concept. When it has been shown to be a straight arrow between the ideas, the game concept is not quite as simple. Great game concepts are almost never created directly from an idea. Typically, the concept has to evolve over time. Game design has always been an exercise in iterative design. This is a circular process that implements a prototype design, tests the results, and finally provides feedback to improve the design and functionality. For games, the iterative game design steps are to create a prototype, test it and gather feedback, evaluate the feedback, extract the results, redesign the idea based on the feedback. Conceptualizing or coming up with the idea is the first step in all of this. There are many ways we can come up with game concepts, and one way is to familiarize yourself with other game developers and the ways that they approach to creating games. Read books, articles, and watch interviews to see how they approach creating game. Speaking more broadly, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, the same person who came up with the concept of flow, also analyzed the creative process. He described the creative stages as preparation, incubation, insight, evaluation, and elaboration. Preparation is becoming immersed with the topic and the set of problems to be solved. Preparation comes in many different forms, and the experience is the best teacher. Going out and exploring games and non-game activities is part of preparation. Incubation is when the ideas start to solidify below our threshold of consciousness. It's the hunch that we get when we notice something that we are doing is fun. Insight is that eureka moment, when the ideas of the parts start coming together. When the idea finally solidifies into a rough concept, now the difficult parts. Evaluation determines if the idea is worth pursuing. For instance, if it was original, or if it had been created, 2 months or, 2,000 years ago. Elaboration is expanding and refining the idea. This is undeniably the longest part of the process where everything is fleshed out. Csikszentmihalyi further mentioned the creative process is less linear than recursive. We know from computing how recursion explores the depths of a problem, and so we can use this to allow us to explore the depths of creativity. Brainstorming is a great way to get started with the idea creation process. We know this is where members of a team discuss a problem and suggest solutions. As mentioned a few times, communication is fundamental to all of this, and this is a great place to start communicating with others about games. Admittedly, there are many approaches to brainstorming ideas, and here are a few suggestions to get started. State a challenge to the team. This is the creative problem to solve which may lead to a game's premise. We can think of this like a game jam challenge. Typically, a game jam is an event where participants attempt to create a game, sometimes from scratch, in very little amounts of time, such as 24 or 48 hours. Commonly, these events are provided challenges in the forms of themes or concepts. These are a great event to get started with participating in the game design process, and I strongly recommend trying one out. No criticism. During this process, there are no bad ideas. Write it all down and then evaluate them later. Consider the classic improvisational comedy rule of yes and, where an improviser agrees to whatever has been previously stated, no matter how absurd, and then continues it further. A no provides an unnecessary roadblock in this process and makes the environment less playful. Speaking of which, a playful environment can help foster creative ideas. If possible, it is good to have a separate brainstorming space from where you are working. Toys and other games or game parts can help the creative process, but we cannot get too focused on just playing. Other brainstorming suggestions are to write it on a board. Having a chalk or marker board around to write down ideas is a great way for the team to keep track of all the ideas. This also allows them to be modified as more ideas are introduced. Having magnets and note cards can also be helpful to put it on a board. Having lots of ideas is better than having few. In this case, quantity is greater than quality in brainstorming, so keep coming up with ideas. Brainstorming is commonly a high-energy activity, so it is best to keep it short and keep the ideas simple. Related to brainstorming, there are other creative approaches to come up with your ideas. One means is to make a list. This is called list creation, and the ideas list everything that you can think of about a topic. Writing them down can help associate some of the ideas into a concept. Idea cards can be used to generate ideas. In this process, you write down a single idea on a card from an entire set of index cards. Then you put them in a bowl or a hat, draw a few cards at a time. Once we have these, consider the combination of the cards. Perhaps they are good ideas that will work well together, and other times not so much. This allows us to play around with the ideas to form an overall concept. Creating a mind map is about starting from a core or a few core ideas that branch out to other ideas. I've said it many times in my courses, when in doubt, draw it out. This helps greatly with being able to visualize and associate ideas and find flaws in the design. The stream of consciousness process begs us to grab a pen and paper and start writing everything about a topic. Alternatively, open a word processor document and start writing. Alternatively still, press record on a voice recorder and start talking about everything related to a topic. Don't worry about it making sense, just express it all. Eventually, you'll go back over the material and discover if there are some good ideas within all the chaos. Creating a cut-up collage can help generate ideas. Cut up magazines, newspapers, and documents, etc., and start piecing it together into a collage. Ideas may come from the strangest places. Finally, there's good old-fashioned research. If there's a topic or a subject that you're interested in, then look it up and read more about it. You may discover that there are many great ideas for play and games within many subjects. As long as you're willing to play with it, you'll find it. Once we have our idea mostly together, we need to create a prototype. This is a working model of the idea that we can use for testing. This is a rough draft for every part, and it acts as an approximation for the final system, sounds, and graphics. One means of creating a prototype is to create a physical prototype. These are commonly made from paper, figurines, dice, spare parts from other games. Basically anything that you can find. We can use these to model and test the most essential features of our game. The benefit of creating a physical prototype is they are cheap and they are easy to change. If we discover a flaw in our design during this process, then it doesn't take much to adjust it. This is in contrast with a big project that is months in development that had a flaw in its initial design. This would be very expensive to change. Physical prototyping gives us a great place to start, but we are creating video games. We move on to creating a digital prototype. This becomes like a rough draft using game code. We create these in order to prototype and test the game's mechanics, aesthetics, kinesthetics, and technology. When we prototype the game mechanics, we are focused on implementing the formal elements of the game. This would include the operational and constitutive rules related to design. We can then prototype the aesthetics of the game. This is the look and the sound of the game, and it relates to the dramatic elements. Going a little further, we can prototype the kinesthetics of the game. This is the feel of the game, and it relates to the concepts of responsiveness of the controls and how the interface reacts to the player's interactions. As we are creating digital games, we must also prototype the technology that we are using. This includes all parts of the technology that we'll be using, including the software and hardware. Some common technologies to prototype are the game engines, AI systems, controllers, physics engines, and so many more. Gathering feedback via playtesting is absolutely necessary in designing a game. As we know, communication is essential to all parts of this. We know that we must practice communicating our game concepts to the players, but we also have to practice listening to the players' feedback. Playtesters are people who play and test their game early on. They provide more insight into what they find enjoyable, what they don't prefer, and what they find confusing about a game. This testing allows us to examine how well we are describing the game and whether or not the game is engaging to others. There are different playtester types, and they are useful in different stages of the process. very early on, we of course do self-testing, which means you play the game to see if it works. Typically, this is done when we are forming the formal elements, and it may have some of the dramatic elements worked out. Once we have some more of the formal elements solidified, and once we have more of the dramatic elements worked out, then we move on to playtesting with confidants. These are commonly people who are friends, family, or those opinions who you respect. Confidants may notice details that may have been missed while self-testing, and provide more encouragement throughout the process. We then move on to our game's target audience. These are people that you do not know, but would be interested in playing your game. At this point, the game's formal and dramatic elements have mostly been fleshed out, and now we need to discover if there are details that we missed, or there are refinements we need to make. A target audience member may be more direct than a confidant, which is preferred. Constructive criticism is provided to improve and not to shame or condemn. Playtesting is not just playing the game. It is a structured procedure with clear goals for the session. It's sort of like a game about making a game. This process includes an introduction, a warm-up discussion, the actual play session, a game experience discussion, and finally a wrap-up. Beside each of these parts is a recommended amount of time to spend during each one of these steps, but this changes from game to game. First is the introduction. For this part, we introduce ourselves and the game concept. Make sure to explain how this game is a work in progress, and most importantly, thank the playtesters for participating. This part should only take around 2 or 3 minutes. Once we move past our salutations, we can start the warm-up discussion. The purpose of this is to ask questions about the playtesters' game experiences, such as the games that they have purchased recently, game preferences, and the such a games that they commonly play. Next, we move on to the play session. This is where you need to inform the playtesters that we are testing a work-in-progress game, and we are testing the game, not their skill. Remind them that there is no wrong answers, and to communicate their thoughts frequently. As communication is fundamental to all parts of this, you must remind the playtesters to think out loud during this process. Ask them to explain their thoughts and detail every action. For instance, a dialogue might include something like, "I think this button will jump." No, that button didn't jump. Which one's jump? Does this game jump? Oh, it's the D-pad. Why isn't it B? If they forget to think out loud, then make sure to periodically ask questions like, "What are your thoughts?" Overall, it is best to quietly observe and take notes. Try not to provide too much assistance if they get stuck, as this could bias their feedback. This should only take 15 to 20 minutes, as if it goes longer, playtesters start becoming tired and lose focus. Once this has been completed, we can then move on to the discussion of the game experience. This is commonly a one-on-one discussion with the playtester. It's best to prepare questions beforehand to gain insight on the interest, difficulty, engagement, and whether they understand the concepts of the game. These questions will become more specific later as the process iterates. However, do not ask leading questions. In this process, because that will definitely bias the results. Keep it broad, so they can fill in their own opinions and not just reflect your own. Some questions to consider are, what are your overall thoughts about the game? What did you like, dislike, and thought was confusing? This one was mentioned early on, and I would consider it to be one of the most important. What were the game's objectives? How would you describe the game to someone else? Was the game easy to pick up and play? All of this information leaves insight into the designs that we need to consider. We then wrap up the playtesting session. Make sure to thank our playtesters again and get their contact information for follow-ups and let them know when the game is finally released. Now, we need to process that data that we have collected into the feedback. We need to evaluate the feedback and extract the results. At this point, I need to mention that we work very hard to design games, so we will always have an emotional attachment to our ideas. This is why I have to mention, don't take feedback personally. We need to move our egos to the side and learn how to listen to playtesters. Yet, some feedback is more valuable than others. And we have to learn what to prioritize and what to ignore. It is best to consider feedback related to the formal and dramatic elements as being the most important and take notes on those. Now we reach a crossroad where we may either accept the results or reject them. If we accept all or some of these results, this means we're going to redesign the idea based on the results and create an updated idea, or idea version X.Y, like version 2.0 or version 1.12. This is the next iterated idea in the process, but it's not as simple as picking a version number. We must critically consider each change and how it affects every part of the game's system. Systems, again, are interrelated and interconnected items, and every little change has an impact across all the parts. We must be careful to consider how we change our idea so it does not unintentionally introduce new problems. Think of this as playing a game of pickup sticks or jackstraws, where even the slightest move can end our turn. Well, not as dramatic. For redesigning, we do consider that both the formal and dramatic elements, and we look for whether or not our ideas are functional, complete, and balanced. Functional in this case means that the game mechanics work in the most minimal way. They still have some bugs, but overall, the mechanics will function as described. Complete means the game is at least functional and the systems work under any condition. This is a lofty goal, as it requires testing every possible configuration within our system. But as long as we find most of the flaws in our system, we can consider it complete. When our system is not complete, then we need to revise the rules and our formal elements. Two big rules when looking for completeness are no loopholes and no dead ends. Loopholes are rules that act as a shortcut for the player to quickly reach an outcome in an unsatisfying way. It feels like a cheap move, and it goes against the implicit rules, while technically not being against the operational rules. On the other hand, dead ends leave the player stuck and frustrated. They're not being cheap, they were following the rules, but they somehow got stuck and cannot advance within the system. In relation to computing, we can consider the system to be deadlocked, a very terrible process synchronicity problem. Both of these flaws made the game not fun, and more importantly, not complete. Balance can be considered the fairness of a game. More specifically, it relates how the player's rules interact with the variable information in the system. How much of a resource is initially given, like health or mana? Where the players initially start? The player's actions and their impact all play a role in balance. More often, the balance in a game is related to the game itself and may change throughout the experience. For a fighting game, we may want all the playable characters to have an equal chance at winning, but a boss character may be overpowered in order to introduce more challenge. If we do find flaws and redesign our game, then we restart the procedure by creating an updated prototype, playtest that to get feedback, evaluate that feedback to get results, and start it all over again if it's needed. However, if we reject the results, or it's not enough to be significant to change, then we finalize the game concept. This is a great time to mention that the iterative process is effective for game development as well. This lecture is only focused on designing the game concept from the idea, but later we will use the process of playtesting, evaluating, and redeveloping in order to improve our game as we develop it. As this process is overall iterative, we can think of the design and development as an evolving creation. This is why most game design documents are written as a wiki and contain all the formal and dramatic elements as sections. We know that a wiki is a web-based, collaboratively edited document. This allows concepts to be organized and updated by all members of the team so that the game design and development can evolve. This is great in contrast to the older game design documents, which were very often long, ambiguous, and unfortunately too rigid. For small games, this can be a good approach, but for teams, a wiki is much better. Another great place to see examples of the game concept and where we can start organizing our game concept is within a game's instructions. This provides all the information needed to set up and play the game. It communicates all the necessary formal and dramatic elements so that the player can start the game. However, this is not the same as a game design document. That document is intended to communicate the game concepts to developers creating the games. Whether these are physically inside of a booklet inside of a board game or digitally as a tutorial or a how-to or getting started guide, these instructions commonly include the following sections: Overview or abstract, materials, setup, turn sequence, win-loss conditions. Looking at these sections in more detail, the overview and abstract is just a short description of the game's rules and play, a brief description of its concepts. Materials are the items needed to play the game, such as boards, cards, pawns, number of players, etc. Setup are the instructions regarding how to assemble the materials to begin the game, puts all the materials in their place to be utilized, and establishes the initial values for certain aspects of the game, such as score and health. Turn sequence are the rules that describe the play. Much of the constitutive and operational rules are in this sequence. Games can be described as a loop of operations. Win-loss conditions describe how the game ends. Goals for either winning or losing are clearly given, and describes how the players can finalize all the materials. Linking this together, we can see how the game's instruction sections relate to the formal elements. The overview abstract is related to all parts, as it gives a brief description of everything. Materials relate to the player's resources and sometimes the boundaries, such as a tennis court. Setup relates to the procedures of setting up the game as the constitutive rules regarding how the resources are initialized. The turn sequence is the game's loop, and includes the parts relating to the objectives and procedures that create conflict within a boundary. This is the heart of the game. Finally, win-loss conditions relate to the outcome of the game. We can also see the connection with the dramatic elements. Once more, the overview and abstract provides insight into all parts of the dramatic or emotional elements of the game. The materials in this case relate to the more abstract concepts related to characters, premise, and story. We can sometimes consider the backstory or the lore about character setting and past events as being the dramatic materials within our stories. Some game instructions have entire sections dedicated to constructing an imagined world before we even begin the game, similar to some video games having essentially a movie providing the context for the game. Setup relates to the play in the sense of where this game will begin. Similarly, it also applies to the characters in the story as it acts as a starting point for all the story and the characters. The turn sequence easily connects to all of the parts as it provides the context to the play and challenge by furthering the dramatic elements of characters and story that generates an overall premise. As mentioned, the turn sequence is a loop and it acts as the heart of the entire system. Finally, the win-loss conditions relate to all the dramatic elements. Beyond the desire to win, the dramatic elements provide additional reasoning about why we should care about the outcomes of these characters. We all enjoy a satisfying conclusion to dramatic stories, and this provides it. Now, let's put this into practice with an example game concept. Our game is going to be called High-Low. High-Low is a guessing game or a secret number guessing game and is a puzzle where the player must guess the correct value that is known by a referee. This classic game is not the same as the card game High-Low, and it is mentioned sometimes as called as the guess the secret number game. The referee, who knows the secret value, tells the player if their guess is too high, too low, or they guessed it correctly. We have the basic idea, now let's start filling out our game concept. We can do this by detailing each section in the rules. About. High-Low is a classic puzzle game where the player must guess the correct known value by the referee. This abstractly details the game. The materials are a player and a referee. Seems simple enough, and now we need to know how to play it. Setup. The referee knows what the secret number is and it doesn't change. Now we know what to do before we begin. We then move into the turn sequence. This details how the game is played. Step 1. The referee informs the player that they know of a secret number. Step 2. The player then guesses a value. Step 3. The referee then tells the player if their guess was higher, lower, or equal to the secret number. Step 4. If the player's guess was equal to the secret number, then the referee informs the player that they have won and ends the game. Step 5. Otherwise, if the player guessed either higher or lower, then inform them and repeat from step 2. Finally, we define winning and losing. The player wins when they guess the secret value. Fairly easy concept. Now that we have this in place, let's examine each of the different parts and start identifying both the formal and dramatic elements. In addition, we are going to use these concepts to relate to the rules and the play schema to better understand the systems. First, in the about, we can see how it mentions the basic formal and dramatic elements in a very brief way. Now we can see that the materials has more specific elements for formal and dramatic. Within the materials, it mentions that the player and the referee. We can consider these to be the players of the game. The resources are simply the player and the referee. More abstractly, we notice that the secret number picked by the referee and the player's guess value act as the main resources related to the player and the referee. In a sense, we can abstractly represent the referee and the player as two numeric values. The boundary is implied as there will be only two players, no more, no less. As for dramatic elements, there are really none to speak of at the moment. There are not any characters or story to provide context. And as mentioned, those dramatic elements are optional. Looking within setup, we can see the formal elements relate to the procedure, rules, and resources. The procedure is the referee must know a secret number which serves as the resource, and the rule is this value does not change. This is an example of imperfect information from the rules schema, as the referee has information that the player does not. Next, we move to the turn sequence and we can start seeing the more formal elements in play. We can see the player's objective is to guess a correct value. The procedure, or steps, defined by the rules mention that the referee will first inform the player that they know a secret number. Next, the operational rules move to focus toward the player, where they have the procedure is to provide a guessed value to the referee. The player's guessed value is a resource and is checked against the secret number resource by the constitutive rule of checking if the value was greater, lesser, or exact. The dramatic conflict emerges when the player's imperfect information leads them to, most likely, not guess the correct value immediately. Therefore, they must keep guessing the values until they get it correct. The boundary is implied as there being only two players as mentioned and not explicitly stated. The dramatic elements relate to the game's play and the challenge. The play is apparent, and the challenge is in the form of having to guess a secret value. We finally get into the winning and losing conditions. We can clearly see that this relates to the outcome of the game where the player wins by guessing the correct value. Again, the challenge and play are the only two dramatic elements in this game, and stem from not being able to guess the correct value quickly. Now, let's test the game concept.
I am thinking of a value. Guess the value.
50,
That's too low.
90,
That's too high.
70,
That's too high.
60,
That's too low.
64.
That's it.
That appeared to work, so the game is at least functional. However, can we consider it complete? Upon further test, we discover there's a loophole in our rules. We notice that the rule of the player wins when they guess the correct value. However, is it possible for them to lose?
I'm thinking of a value. Guess the value.
4,
That's too low.
4,
That's too low.
4,
That's too low.
4,
That's
4,
too low.
4,
That's too
4,
low.
4, 4.
Please stop.
Along with this, we also notice another loophole from the beginning. If the number is always known and doesn't change, then it's constant. Once the player knows this, the game cannot be played again and again as they already know the answer. This creates an extremely periodic system to the point that it's nearly fixed. There's no place for creative strategies, and it is not a complex system, so it would not be very interesting for them to play.
I'm thinking of a value. Guess the value.
64.
That's it. Would you like to play again?
Yes.
I'm thinking of a value. Guess the value.
64.
That's it. Would you like to play again?
Yes.
I'm thinking of a value. Guess the value.
64.
That's it. Would you like to play again?
No. Never again.
In addition to this, is there any kind of boundaries related to the secret number? It could be anything, and this could quickly throw off the game's balance to the point that it can be considered deadlocked.
I'm thinking of a number. Guess the number.
64.
That's too low.
128.
That's too low.
256.
That's too low.
256.
That's too low.
512.
That's too low.
1024.
That's too low.
2048.
That's too low.
4196.
That's too low.
18 quintillion, 446 quadrillion, 744 trillion, 73 billion, 709 million, 551,661.
That's it. 2 to the power of 64.
That would take as long as the Towers of Hanoi problem. How can we use some other aspects of the rules to make the game more complex? We may consider using uncertainty to make it more complex. What if the secret number was not fixed, but randomly selected from a range of values? If the player knows the range, then they can form a better strategy to solve it. Let's see a quick redesign and with some new considerations to play. We can now see the setup is slightly different and it features more uncertainty. Now the referee selects a value from 1 to 100, so the game can be played many times over again reasonably. This also creates a better space for emergence as it addresses some of the loopholes in the first version. Now we see the turn sequence features a turn counter, and this addresses the loophole where the player could not lose. This also augments the games by adding an additional level of conflict where the player has to guess within the value with only a few number of turns. This new resource, a turn counter, is used in turn to augment the play and increase the challenge. We can see the explicit winning and losing condition here, which is more clearly defining the outcome. Let's see this once more to see if this works.
I'm thinking of a value from 0 to 99. You only have 5 guesses. Guess the value.
4.
That's too low.
98.
That's too high.
77.
That's too high.
52.
That's too low.
68.
You have run out of guesses. You lose. The correct value was 64.
That seemed to work. Let's see it one more time.
I'm thinking of a value from 0 to 99. You only have 5 guesses. Guess the value.
4.
That's too low.
77.
That's too high.
64.
That's correct.
Success! We created a game concept that works. Perhaps it's not the most advanced game created, but it has all the formal and the required dramatic elements to work. Keep in mind, this is an iterative circular process and designing game takes time. In the next lecture, we move past game design and start looking more into game development. With all that being said, start thinking about those formal and dramatic elements, and I'll speak at you next time. Now it's time for a bonus round. What are the 8 formal elements of a game? Players, objectives, procedures, rules, resources, conflict, boundary, outcome. What are the 5 dramatic elements of a game? Challenge, play, characters, premise, story. What is iterative design? Iterative design is a circular process that implements a prototype design, tests the results, and finally provides feedback to improve the overall design and functionality. What are the iterative game design steps? Create a prototype. Test it and gather feedback. Evaluate the feedback and extract the results. Redesign the idea based on the feedback. Game design documents are now implemented as what? A game design wiki. This allows for more effective collaboration and quick edits. What are the 5 most common sections found in a game's instructions? Overview abstract, materials, setup, turn sequence, win-loss conditions.